Here are a few simple rules for a successful trend board. If you keep the acronym CARP, like C-A-R-P, like the fish, in mind, you can kind of be sure that you're going to be heading in the right direction with layout. Contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity. Here are some examples. Contrast, to start with, here's an example where we have a value contrast and a saturation contrast. In other words, the white letters stand off of the black and gray background. As well, the analogous color palette is fully saturated or more saturated than the background, and it contrasts from the background. So we know what's important in this image, and contrast helps direct the viewer's eye. Always look for contrast. Whenever you can't read letters, it's often because they're competing visually with the background. Alignment's really important because not only do you sometimes have to put in text or other information, but sometimes you need to organize some of your elements. So in this case, the four standing figures stand on top of some of the inspiration photos, which are desaturated and lowered in transparency. Also, that's to create some contrast. She didn't want her pastels to be oversaturated, so she desaturated the lower images, the inspiration photos, so that the four figures lined up along the frieze-like composition would stand out. So they're aligned all along that bottom row. That's like her anchor point. It's where everything's lined up to. The next is repetition. The more repetition, the better, I feel. It helps direct the viewer's eye. It tells us what to consider and what's important. And in this particular case, the four red maxis are not confused with anything else. We know that's what's important. We almost don't even need the title because it's repeated 3 times or more. So we know what's important because of the repetition. Also, there's some saturation contrast. The red stands out against the desaturated background. So there are some other rules applied here, really, but this is a great example, I think, of repetition. Lastly is proximity. How are things grouped together? What's placed next to one another and what's not? In the example here, they say, well, don't place things too far apart. Well, you can have things placed far apart, but what helps is if things are overlapped, and that's what this graphic says. You'll see here that 3 figures in the foreground are grouped together. They're overlapped one another, and they make their own group. And they also tell you what's important. Floral dresses, right? The next are the figures on the left and right, and then the title. So because these 3 figures are placed in proximity to one another, they're overlapping and they're very close, they stand out, and their scale is larger too, so it once again directs your attention to what's important. The basic layout, how you're going to place these elements on the page, can be considered maybe even more generally. Think of CARP, but also think about these simple layout conventions. These are taken from photography conventions, but they can be applied here. So the S-curve, which goes from corner to corner. In this particular case, again, her figures actually march along an S-curve. They go from the upper right to the lower left. You can use a cross-corner composition, align things along an imaginary line that goes from one corner to the other. If you place elements on the rule of thirds, in other words, divide the space up into thirds, and where the thirds converge, highlighted by yellow circles here, if you place elements on those, you'll have a pretty good chance of balancing this composition. So in this case, you can see that her figures' heads are placed approximately on the rule of thirds. Not exactly, but it's still fairly well balanced. A couple of the things to consider also here are the figures' heads face inward generally toward the center. So in other words, she's not looking off the page, she's looking in. She's actually looking down at her, isn't she? Good example. Last is radial balance, or second to last, I'm sorry, is radial balance. Things placed along a circular path. So in this case, you can see in the sample that student made, she has arranged things along an imaginary radial balanced composition. Title, swatches, figure, jackets, all are along this line. Symmetry and approximately symmetrical layouts are great. This is an approximately symmetrical layout. Things are not perfectly mirrored from side to side, top to bottom, or left to right, but they're very close, and that makes a very interesting layout. And of course, asymmetry is most other examples such as this. Whenever you lay something out along an S-curve or a cross corner, things are going to be different on one side to the other. All of this goes to create a hierarchy in your design. And what we want to do is let the viewer know what's important in the piece, what the inspiration of the trend is, without having to outright tell them with the title. The title is really set to reinforce the concept or the trend. So in this case, grouping and the proximity here tells us that these three figures in the foreground are most important and they're showing off the trend. Oftentimes we'll see trend boards that don't have a hierarchy. We don't know which element in the trend board is most important. We want to know what's most important by using composition elements like carp, contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity.